Okay, this is the final section of the Palace Leaf. We are starting on page 198. Remember at the end of last section, Hunter feels like he called out Sedgwick and tells him he saw the earpiece that he was receiving the answers from, and Sedgwick replies, "And I see that you have not changed either." Well, had I? As the craft lifted off and turned westward toward the bank of clouds that hid the distant shoreline, I analyzed the situation with some care. The wooden turrets of the lodge grew smaller, and then were lost in the trees, and I found it easier to think then, for everything on that island had been imbued with the sheer power of the man. I relaxed a bit in my seat. One could say that in this case I indeed had acted properly, for is it not the glory of our legal system that acquitting a guilty man is less heinous than convicting an innocent one? At the time of the contest I certainly had no proof of Sedgwick Bell's behavior. Yet back at Woodmere, as I have intimated, I found myself with a great deal of time on my hands, and it was not long before the incident began to replay itself in my mind. Following the wooded trail toward the river, or sitting in the breeze at dusk on the porch, I began to see that a different ending would have better served us all. Conviction had failed me again. I was well aware of the foolish constellation of my thoughts, yet I vividly imagined what I should have done. I heard myself speaking up. I saw my resolute steps to his chair on the stage, then the insidious flesh-colored device in my palm, held up to the crowd. I heard him stammering. As if to mock my inaction, however, stories of his electoral efforts soon began to appear in the papers. It was a year of spite and rancor in the country's politics, and the race in West Virginia was less a campaign than a brawl between gladiators. The incumbent was as versed in treachery as Sedgwick Bell, and over my morning tea I followed their battles. Sedgwick Bell called him a liar when he speaks and a crook when he acts, and he called Sedgwick Bell worse. A fistfight erupted when their campaigns crossed at the airport. I was revolted by the spectacle, but of course I was also intrigued, and I cannot deny that although I was rooting for the incumbent, a part of me was also cheered at each bit of news chronicling Sedgwick Bell's assault on his lead. Oh, why was this so? Are we all at base creatures without virtue? Is fervor the only thing we follow? Needless to say, that fall had been a difficult one of my life, especially those afternoons when the St. Benedict's bus roared by the guest house at Woodmere, taking the boys to track meets, and perhaps the Senate race was nothing more than a healthy distraction for me. Indeed, I needed distractions. To witness the turning of the leaves and to smell the apples in their barrels without hearing the sound of 100 boys in the fields after all was almost more than I could bear. My walks had grown longer, and several times I had crossed the river and ventured to the far end of the marsh, from where in the distance I could make out the blurred figures of St. Benedict's. I knew this was not good for me, and perhaps that is why in late October of that year, when I read that Sedgwick Bell would be making a campaign stop at the Coal Miners' Union Hall near the Virginia border, I decided to go hear him speak. Perhaps by then the boy had become an obsession for me. I will admit this, for I am as aware as anyone that time is but the thinnest bandage for our wounds. But on the other hand, the race had grown quite close and would have been of natural interest to anyone. Sedgwick Bell had drawn himself up from the underdog to challenger. Now it was clear that the election hinged on the votes of labor, and Sedgwick Bell, though he was the son of aristocrats and a chairman of a formidable corporation, began to cast himself as a champion of the working man. From the newspaper reports I gleaned that he was helped along by the power of his voice and bearing, and I could easily imagine these men turning to him. I well knew the charisma of the boy. The day arrived, and I packed a lunch and made the trip. As the bus wound west along the river valley, I envisioned the scene ahead and wondered whether Sedgwick Bell would at this point care to see me. Certainly I represented some sort of truth to him about himself, yet at the same time I also seemed to have become a part of the very delusion that he had foisted on those around him. How far my boys would always stride upon the world's stage, yet how dearly I would always hope to change them. The bus arrived early, and I went inside the Union Hall to wait. Shortly before noon, the miners began to come in. I don't know what I had expected, but I was surprised to see them looking as though they had indeed just come out of the mines. They wore hard hats, their faces were stained with dust, and their gloves and tool belts hung at their waists. For some reason I had worn my St. Benedict's blazer, which I now removed. Reporters began to filter in as well, and by the time the noon whistle blew, the crowd was overflowing from the hall. As the whistle subsided, I heard the thump-thump of his helicopter, and through the door a moment later I saw the twister of dust as it hovered into view from above. How clever was a man I had known as a boy! The craft had been repainted the colors of military camouflage, but it had left the sponsons the red, white, and blue of their previous incarnation. He jumped from the side door when the craft was still a foot above the ground, entered the hall at a jog, and was greeted with an explosion of applause. His aides lined the stairs to the high platform on which the microphone stood under a banner and a flag, and as he crossed the crowd toward them, the miners jostled to be near him, knocking their knuckles against his hard hat, reaching for his hands and his shoulders, cheering like Romans at a chariot race. I do not need to report on his eloquence, for I have dwelled enough upon it. When he reached the staircase and ascended to the podium, stopping first at the landing to wave and then the top to salute the flag above him, jubilation swept among the throng. I knew then that he had succeeded in his efforts, that these miners counted him somehow as their own, so that when he actually spoke and they interrupted him with cheers, it was no more unexpected than the promises he made then to carry their interests with him to the Senate. He was masterful. I found my own arm upraised. Certainly there were 500 men in that hall, but there was only one with a St. Benedict's blazer over his shoulder and no hard hat on his head. So of course I should not have been surprised when within a few minutes one of his aides appeared beside me and told me that the candidate had asked for me at the podium. At that moment I saw Cedric Bell's glance pause for a moment on my face. There was a flicker of a smile on his lips. Then he looked away. Is there no battle other than a personal one? Was Cedric Bell at this point willing to risk the future of his political idea for whatever childhood demon I still remained to him? The next time he turned toward me, he gestured down at the floor, and in a moment the aide had pulled my arm and was escorting me toward the platform. The crowd opened as we passed, and the miners, in their ignorance and jubilation, were reaching to shake my hand. This was indeed a heady feeling. I climbed the steps and stood beside Cedric Bell at the smaller microphone. How it was to stand above the mass of men like that. He raised his hand, then cheered. He lowered it, and then fell silent. There's a man here today who has been immeasurably important in my life, he whispered into the microphone. There was applause, and a few men whistled. Thank you, I said into my own. I could see the blue underbrims of 500 hard hats turned up toward me. My heart was nearly bursting. My history teacher, he said as the crowd began to cheer again. Flashbulbs popped, and I moved instinctively toward the front of the platform. Mr. Hundert, he boomed, from 45 years ago, Richmond Central High School. It took me a moment to realize what he had said. By then he too was clapping, and at the same time lowering his head in what must have appeared to the men below to be respect for me. The blood engorged my veins. Just a minute, I said, stepping back to my own microphone. I taught you at St. Benedict's School in Woodmere, Virginia. Here's the blazer. Of course, it makes no difference in the course of history that as I tried to hold up the coat, Cedric Bell moved swiftly across the podium, took it from my grip, and raised my arm high in his own, and that this pose, of all things, sent the miners into jubilation. It makes no difference that by the time I spoke, he had gestured with his hand so that one of his aides had already shut off my microphone. For one does not alter history without conviction. It is enough to know that I did speak, and certainly a consolation that Cedric Bell realized, finally, that I would. He won that election, not in small part because he managed to convince those miners that he was one of them. They were ignorant people, and I cannot blame them for taking to the shrewdly populist rhetoric of the man. I saved the picture that appeared the following morning in the Gazette. Senator Bell, radiating all the populist magnetism of his father, holding high the arm of an old man who has on his face the remnants of a proud and foolish smile. I still live in Woodmere, and I have found a route that I take now and then to the single high hill from which I can see the St. Benedict steeple across the Passamic. I take 2 walks every day and have grown used to this life. I've even come to like it. I am reading of the ancient Japanese civilizations now, which I had somehow neglected before, and every so often one of my boys visits me. One afternoon recently, Deepak Mehta did so, and we shared some brandy. This was in the fall of last year. He was still the quiet boy he had always been, and not long after he had taken a seat on my couch, I had to turn on the television to ease, for him, the burden of conversation. As it happened, the Senate Judiciary Committee was holding its famous hearings then, and the two of us sat there watching, nodding our heads or chuckling whenever the camera showed Cedric Bell sitting alongside the chairman. I had poured the brandy liberally, and whenever Cedric Bell leaned into the microphone and asked a question of the witness, Deepak would mimic his affected southern drawl. Naturally, I could not exactly encourage this behavior, but I did nothing to stop it. When he finished his drink, I poured him another. This, of course, is perhaps the greatest pleasure of a teacher's life, to have a drink one day with a man he has known as a boy. Nonetheless, I only wish we could have talked more than we actually did. But I'm afraid that there must always be a reticence between a teacher and a student. Deepak had had another small heart attack, he told me, and I felt it would have been improper of me to inquire more. I tried to bring myself to broach the subject of Sedgwick's history, but here again I was aware that a teacher does not discuss one boy with another. Certainly Deepak must have known about Sedgwick Bell as well, but probably because of his own set of St. Benedict's morals he did not bring it up with me. We watched Sedgwick Bell question the witness and then whisper into the ear of the chairman. Neither of us was surprised at his ascendance, I believe, because both of us were students of history. Yet we did not discuss this either. Still, I wanted desperately for him to ask me something more, and perhaps this is why I kept refilling his glass. I wanted him to ask, "How is it to be alone, sir, at this age?" Or perhaps to say, "You made a difference in my life, Mr. Hunter." But of course, these were not things Deepak Mehta would ever say. A man's character is his character. Nonetheless, it was startling every now and then when I looked over at the sunlight falling across his bow head to see that Deepak Mehta, the quietest of my boys, was now an old man.